Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Athenaeum Spotlight with Guy McClain. That's Guy McClain. I'm Mark Auerbach, and you jazzed up our opening music today, Guy.
Yes. I thought I'd do something a little unique. We've been using Copland's hoedown from his ballet piece Rodeo. Which is a small section of that larger dance movement, but and we usually been using the orchestral version, which of course is what most people associate with that music. But Emerson, Lake and Palmer in the 1970s decided to do their own version of Copland's hoedown, and so I thought as a change of pace. We would use the electronic Emerson, Lake and Palmer version of it, which is kind of a nice change of pace.
I sort of like that, actually.
A last-minute request that I was able to fulfill.
Yeah, I sort of like that. That's different. It's funny because the other day I was doing for another project, somebody asked me about the opera by Kurt Weill called The Rise and Fall of the City of Mahagoni.
Yes.
Which has the Alabama whiskey song in it.
Right.
So I played the Doors version of it, which was popular in the mid-'60s, when everybody was tuning in, turning on, and dropping out, kind of thing. And somebody said, my God, that's from an opera? Yeah, that's the Doors singing. The whiskey song.
Well, one thing that's very interesting, I mean, a lot of people, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, it seems like they've kind of gone away and not too many people listen to Emerson, Lake and Palmer anymore, but they did a bunch of versions of classical music pieces using electronics. They were quite virtuosic musicians. I mean, they were really good, but they used electronic keyboards and synthesizers and electric guitars and all that, but they did incredible versions of these classical music pieces.
You realize that you've changed your entire reputation. People in Westfield know you're the director of the Westfield Athenaeum, and you're an intellect, and you deal with high art and all this, and then you walk in with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. That certainly adds a dimension to Guy McClain.
Yeah. Well, it just shows you that I have a broad range of references, and of course it shows my age too, because I grew up listening to Emerson, Lake and Palmer. They were kind of big when I was in high school, so I still remember them from the old days. But it's interesting. I think a lot of people, they didn't like the fact that there was kind of in the rock world there was kind of a prejudice against Emerson, Lake and Palmer because they were doing things like taking classical music pieces and doing rock music versions of them. Somehow they didn't seem authentic or something. But I think they're pretty interesting, and they were quite good musicians there. So I think it's interesting to kind of pull them out sometimes and listen to them for a change of pace, at least, right?
Yeah, that was very cool. So what's happening at the Westfield Athenaeum?
Well, we're getting ready for the concert series that we're about to start, going back to regular classical music. The musicians of the Springfield Symphony Orchestra are going to be performing in early March, and we're really excited about that. We think that's going to be a great concert. And already the response we're getting, people are buying tickets. I'm getting calls from people saying, "Oh, we're really excited to see this." I think the community is really ready for some good classical music to be performed here in Westfield. That's something that during the pandemic and even before, there wasn't a lot of classical music concerts being played in Westfield, and it's nice for it to have it back, and by such a good group of musicians. I think the Springfield Symphony Orchestra musicians, that's a great group, and I think it'll be really nice to hear what they
and that Musso group is bringing, the first one is string music, a string quartet. And the second one, April 14th, is a wind quintet.
Right, woodwind quintet, which I'm excited about. And the programs they're putting together, I'm especially impressed with the programs they're putting together. They're putting together some really interesting programs. I think one of the problems in classical music today is sometimes the programs can get kind of boring. They just pull out the same regular stuff and perform, the standard, Beethoven or Mozart or Brahms piece. Well, one thing about this opening concert is they're doing two American composers. Charles Ives, a New England composer of the early 20th century, who was really an original, kind of an iconoclast, but he did some incredibly interesting music, very, very different than regular classical music. And then the other composer, William Grant Still, a great African-American composer who has not been given the attention he really deserves. And I think part of it is because it's like, African Americans don't necessarily, do classical music. Well, yes, they do. And William Grant Still is a good example of a truly great composer who wrote symphonies, operas, chamber music, and they're going to play one of his string quartet pieces, which is just a lovely piece. It's a beautiful work. But it's very, very interesting because, yes, there are some jazz elements and things in it, but it's really a great work of classical music, and I think people are going to really enjoy that piece.
And the thing is that if you buy a ticket for that, then the shows, I think, are at 7 o'clock.
7 o'clock.
Then you can come at 6 o'clock and hear you kind of give like a program notes beforehand, so there won't be a printed program. You get to hear Guy McClain talk about the music.
Yes. We're going to have quite a discussion. I think it'll be really interesting to get together a group before the concert to talk about these pieces because there's a lot of interesting things to talk about in these works. I mean, Charles Ives is one of the most original composers to come out of the United States throughout our history. He really gave a completely new approach to writing classical music around the turn of the century. He went to Yale, studied at Yale with one of the more traditional composers of the day, Horatio Parker, who still gets played occasionally. He also wrote a lot of interesting classical music, but Charles Ives took a completely new direction. He did all kinds of experiments in music. He was kind of interesting. He must have been a very sensitive young man when he was growing up, and he became intrigued by things like. At that time, in New England towns, every town had several marching bands that would play concerts on the green or would march in parades and things like that. And one time when he was a young man, he heard two marching bands coming from opposite directions and coming toward each other, but they were playing different marches in different keys. And he was listening to the relationship of that and how it changed with the distance away and the fact that you could hear both, where he was standing, he could hear both bands coming from different directions. And he thought, isn't that interesting? And so he actually explored that in his own pieces. His symphonies actually sometimes have two melodies going at the same time in two different keys, and yet it works. It's incredible how well it works. He was an interesting man in other ways. At that time, it was really hard to make it in the United States in classical music, to make a living at it. And so he went into the insurance business. He was a graduate from Yale. He went into insurance and became quite a successful insurance executive in New York City. And later on, he formed a partnership with another person in the insurance company. In fact, he was actually one of the innovators in estate planning. Insurance companies were just getting into the idea of estate planning for you when you retire and this sort of thing. And he actually was quite innovative in that area. Came up with some new ideas on how to do that. And so he was a very successful insurance executive. And he had a partner in New York City, and it was interesting. They were moving their offices, and they were cleaning out desk drawers and file cabinets and things like that. And his partner opened up the file, and his partner didn't know much about what he was doing as a composer. But his partner opened up the bottom drawer of a file cabinet and pulled out this big score of music. All right. And he said, Charles, can I throw this out? It's just kind of sitting in the bottom of this drawer. And Charles Ives went, oh, no, that's my Fourth Symphony. So I mean, he was not your typical composer.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
And the second one, I know that Beth Welty, who is one of the officers of MOSO, the opening concert is her string quartet.
Yes.
The second one, Nancy Dimmock, who is a wind player of the symphony, and Ann Bobo, had put together this program of wind music that includes Pulcinella. Which is kind of cool.
Yes.
And I know that the third program will be in May 19th, I believe. They're working on that now, and I've seen a draft of some of the things they're thinking about. So I I don't know. I think that's a kind of a diverse set of concerts. But the thing is that only a limited number of tickets are being sold for each of them. So if you wait until the last minute, you're not going to get in.
Yeah, yeah. We're already getting very, very close to selling out the first concert, and we're already starting selling tickets to the second. And one thing, we have a wonderful auditorium at the Athenaeum that's a great place to hear chamber music, which of course these 3 concerts will be chamber concerts. But what that means is there's a limited number of tickets available. So yes, people should get their tickets really quickly, because we're gonna sell. We're close to selling out this first one, and I think we'll sell out all 3 of them. And you're absolutely right. I think one of the things about this series of 3 concerts is the listeners who come to all 3 of these are going to get incredibly different experiences, different ensembles, different music, just a wide selection of different pieces. And so I'm looking forward to it myself. I always enjoy concerts where the musicians bring in pieces that are not played as often. They're not kind of the regular pieces. And so this is an opportunity to hear a lot of things that you don't normally hear in concerts.
And I happen to know this because Beth Welty told me. There is a 4th piece of music on the opening concert in March that they're going to not tell you about. It's a surprise. But it comes from the genre of music that is not considered classical per se, but it's a kind of music that I'm listening to in the car all day long.
Yeah. And I think this shows what's happening with classical music concerts today. Is I think there's a recognition in the classical music world is that there's a lot of other musical traditions and things that are out there that are interesting and unique and have something to offer that, in some cases even very profound music coming out of other musical traditions. And I think, we're seeing this a lot in the classical music world today, is that musicians in their concert programming are bringing in new styles into the classical music concerts. Also, too, I think it's very interesting, a lot of composers working today in the classical music tradition. They went to the traditional academies. They went to Juilliard, one of the great music learning institutions in the world, for that matter, in New York City, and Curtis Institute in Philadelphia, Eastman in Rochester. All these great musical academies are producing musicians and composers who are combining different traditions. They're studying jazz and other kinds of popular music, Broadway musicals, as well as the classical music tradition. And so, especially with composers today are as likely to pull from the jazz tradition or other kinds of popular music traditions as they are from classical music, and they're combining music in all kinds of unique ways now and producing really interesting stuff.
When you started the show today with Emerson, Lake and Palmer performing Aaron Copland, I just am reminded sometimes, like Aretha Franklin sang Nessun Dorma.
Yes.
From the opera Turandot.
Yes.
At a rock concert. And she gave it her own twist. It wasn't what you'd expect on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera. But boy, that piece of music was powerful when it was reinterpreted by a soul, an R&B singer, and given a new thing. So, like they say, everything old is new again when you take a look at it from a fresh perspective.
Well, and this shows something that I think that's really happening in the music world today, is that Aretha Franklin, we think of her as a rock blues soul singer, but clearly, the very fact that she could sing Nessun Dorma from Puccini's great opera Turandot is an indication that she studied that music herself, is knowledgeable about the classical music tradition, and is able to use that in a new and unique way. That's really the definition of an artist, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, you look at Lady Gaga,
yes,
who can do rock, and then she can turn these classical pop and jazz standards and sing with Tony Bennett, who is an icon of pop music.
Yes.
And switch on a dime to do it. That's really incredible. And some of these musicians playing in Moso that are performing in these things can do that.
Right, right. I think we're seeing this more and more, is that musicians coming out of the academy, they're not just studying one musical tradition, they're studying several. And that's one thing that's very interesting about music today is the diversity out there. And so, and let's face it, we live in a time where you can go on the internet and you can access music from any period, pull that up, and utilize that music, and be influenced by that music. One of the things I pointed out in some of my music lectures in the past is that people today can hear more Baroque music than people who lived in the Baroque era.
Yeah, and not only that, but you find these classical musicians, and I know a lot of the Mosso musicians because I came to Springfield to work at the Springfield Symphony eons ago. Some of them have very diverse musical backgrounds. The tuba player, Steve Perry, who plays with the Hartford Symphony and the Springfield Symphony, he will not be on the Athenaeum series, but he played in the Broadway musical Barnum, and they had the Sousa Band marching through the theater in Barnum, and you go on the weeknight, and there was Steve Perry with his tuba marching down the aisle of the theater.
Yes.
Or Bob Lawrence, who's one of the violinists, played in the orchestra for the musical Baby and some of the others. And they all have interesting backgrounds. And the thing about chamber music, when you get to see musicians and meet them, you realize there are differences in their backgrounds and what they bring to a stage. And they bring their own little personalities and backgrounds to performance. Makes it really kind of interesting.
Yeah. And I think, my own experience, even, I was studying music back in the 1970s, and one of the things that I was doing as a musician, I was more oriented toward classical music. I was working in that area, but I also did a lot of jazz, and I actually played in some rock bands because you go out there, there's some interesting things going on in these other areas, and there was a demand for that, and so I performed in all three of those different genres, and I think a lot of musicians today are doing that. Even symphony orchestra musicians, they might be performing in a jazz ensemble as well, or for that matter, a rock band, or other kinds of ensembles, doing Broadway musicals, as things come up. So, I think this is a good thing, this eclectic mix that of music that's out there that's available for us to hear through recordings and the internet, and how easy the access is, but also too the fact that musicians are being trained in different traditions when they go to music school means that there's just all kinds of interesting mixtures today. I think I heard about a group not long ago coming out of Finland that's a metal group. It's a symphonic metal. There actually is a category, a kind of a sub genre of the metal music world that's symphonic metal. And this group, the main composer for this metal group called Nightwish, his name is Thomas Holopainen, and he came out of the Sibelius Music Academy. Sibelius being the great classical music composer to come out of Finland, which is he's a national hero in Finland, and the main music academy in Helsinki, Finland, is the Sibelius Academy, and all these musicians that are playing in this symphonic metal group came out of the Sibelius Academy. The head singer of this group is a woman who studied opera. She's an opera singer, and she does opera as well as sing in a metal group. And so you see all these combinations happening, and they're not the only group. There's a group out of Sweden, another metal group. There's 4 cellists who have their cellos mic'd, but they're classical cellists doing metal music, but they're doing it in very interesting new ways, combining classical music with popular music. In this case, metal. So you can see from ensembles like this that there's an incredible variety of music out there in various genres, and I think that's what we're seeing here with what the Springfield Symphony Orchestra musicians are doing. They're putting together unique, interesting programs of music they've discovered from different traditions. Clearly, they're doing a lot of mainly classical music, but they're throwing in other things too, and I think that's great. I think it's going to make the concerts even more interesting.
So how do people get tickets to these?
Well, there's 2 ways. You can just come by the Athenaeum, go up to the circulation desk where you would take your books to check them out. And just ask them for a ticket to the concert, either one of the 3 concerts that you want to go to, or all 3 of them, and they have tickets right there at the desk. The other way you can do it, if you don't want to come into the Athenaeum, you can go on to our website. That's westath.org. WESTATH.org, and you can go. There's a PayPal link right there. You can go to it. There's a buy tickets. You can just click on that link. Takes you to a PayPal account, and you can buy your tickets right there. So
How simple is that?
It's really easy.
So we've just finished a vacation week, a school vacation week. Attendance back up? Are people going out now?
Oh yeah. The Athenaeum is really busy. We've got a lot of things going on. We've got lots of children's programs going on, lots of adult programs, and we're doing hybrid programs. We're doing both in-house programs, and we're doing programs online. So there's a real great variety. One of the things we learned when we couldn't have in-house programs during the pandemic is we started doing a lot of programs online through Zoom and by other means. But we've kept that up because we realize a lot of people can't get in. Sometimes people have trouble driving at night, or they're homebound or whatever. So we're doing a combination of programs, but also just regular visitation. Library. The other day I went in there, and almost every one of we have a lot of computers that people can come in to use for maybe working on a resume or working on some other project. Almost all the computers were taken, were being used when I walked through the other day. So it's great to see public libraries back to functioning as they did in the past, where people were coming in, checking out books, working on maybe student projects, doing other things.
Yeah. We have a guest in the second segment today, but before we, take a break and acknowledge underwriters and stuff like that, have you gone to any cool shows? You done anything cool in the last 3 weeks since we've chatted?
Yes. Speaking of getting out and getting back into it, I went into Boston a couple of weeks ago. Went to a great concert, the Boston Symphony. Ephraim Bromford, one of the great pianists working today. He's from Israel. Did Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, and most people, when they hear a Rachmaninoff concerto, they'll usually hear the second. The second is his most popular work. The third is not played as much, mainly because it's so difficult. It's a longer piano concerto than the first and the second, but it's also considered really difficult. In fact, for concert pianists, it's kind of like you've made it when you can give a good performance of Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, and they were doing Rachmaninoff's Third, and so it was a real treat to hear that. And then they also did Romeo and Juliet by Prokofiev. A suite of music from the ballet that was done. He wrote that in the 1930s. It's a wonderful piece, wonderful, very interesting harmonies that Prokofiev used, and it's just an incredible piece. And it gives a completely different interpretation of Romeo and Juliet. It gives a completely different kind of perspective on the Shakespeare play Romeo and Juliet. So it was a wonderful concert. I really enjoyed that. So, and then while I was in Boston, I went over to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and they've done a lot of changes to their galleries. They've completely redone their 16th and 17th century Dutch art section. Beautiful. If you're in Boston and you can make it by to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, you got to go by and see that. They've also completely redone their Greek and Roman art section. And of course, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts has a wonderful collection of Greek and Roman art, and they've completely renovated those galleries. So for people interested in art, you got to get in and see what the Boston Museum of Fine Arts has been doing with some of their galleries.
It's one of the best museums in the world.
It really is. It really. I just am astounded. Their collections are just amazing, especially in categories like Dutch art, French Impressionism, Greek and Roman art, medieval art, also Asian art. I mean, I think Boston Museum of Fine Arts has one of the best Asian art collections in in the United States. So yeah, you can never you can always find something really interesting to see going to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts.
I've been getting out and about to the theater. I saw the 10 by 10 at Barrington Stage, which is an annual event of 10-minute one-act plays. That
sounds fascinating.
Runs comedy to tragedy and all of that. And there's a great play, This Bitter Earth, running at Theater Works in Hartford, and My Fair Lady that is at the Bushnell. So there's a lot to go and do and see. I'm glad to be out and about again.
Yeah, that's great that they're doing They're doing a revival of My Fair Lady. It's one of my favorites.
The Lincoln Center production that was revived a couple of years ago with Lauren Ambrose, who was from the TV series 6 Feet Under, who happens to be from Western Massachusetts. This is the national tour of it. It's got different people in it, but it's probably the first Broadway musical I ever saw as a kid.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It came out in the late 1950s. I think it's one of the musicals that came out really at the height.
I don't know about you growing up. I mean, my mother had that cast recording of My Fair Lady, and you watch on television, and they would always have, like on the Ed Sullivan Show and things, there'd be a scene from My Fair Lady.
Yes.
So I remember it as a kid, and what intrigued me about it, oddly enough, that I remembered the most, I must have been 5 or 6 when she took me to New York. It was the first time I'd ever been in a Broadway theater, but the set changes. The set change from the streets of London to the Embassy Ball, and the Embassy came floating in from a top thing. I'll never forget that. It's one of those. Now, of all the shows I've seen subsequent, it wasn't a big deal. But to a 5 or 6-year-old, it was like, wow, this is too cool.
And I remember, because my parents, the same thing. They also had the cast recording, and then later on when the film came out, with Audrey Hepburn and Rex Harrison. If people haven't seen the film, you got to see the film because it's just an iconic performance by Audrey Hepburn. I think she didn't sing it herself. There was another singer. I'm trying to remember the name of
Marnie Nixon.
Marnie Nixon.
Marnie Nixon dubbed so many. She dubbed Deborah Kerr in The King and I.
Yeah.
All these other great people, but she actually towards the end of her career got to do some Broadway work as Marnie Nixon.
Yeah.
She was quite good.
Yeah, she was a great singer. She really was.
So we're going to take a break here to acknowledge the underwriters that make Athenaeum Spotlight with Guy McClain possible. Peter Coles is our chief engineer. We come back. We have a guest. We're going to be talking about Russian icons.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. It should be an interesting discussion.
So if you missed a part of today's program or you want to catch it again or share it with friends, you'll find Athenaeum Spotlight archived on WSKB Community Radio's YouTube page. Peter Coles is our chief engineer. I'm Mark Auerbach, and we'll return after these messages.
Support for community radio on WSKB is provided by Betts Plumbing and Heating Supply Company, an independent, family-owned wholesaler serving Westfield for over 50 years, specializing in plumbing, heating, and industrial piping supplies. On the web at bettsplumbing.com or at 14 Coleman Avenue in Westfield.
Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by the Dunkin' Donut Shops of Westfield and the Sardinia family. It's nice to know that even as the world changes, Dunkin' Coffee remains the same at 7 convenient locations throughout Westfield.
Join us every Thursday morning
from 6 until at least 7:30.
Check out the Bobby G and Company Show
right here on WSKB 89.5
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB. Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 at 89.5 FM WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to Athenaeum Spotlight, everyone. I'm Mark Auerbach. This is Guy McClain, who is the director of the Westfield Athenaeum. We made a comment about Russian icons, but apparently our Russian icon guest is indisposed, as one might say.
Yes. So yeah, and I'm kind of disappointed. I was very interested in hearing about this museum that's only 15 years old now. and it has apparently a very interesting collection of Russian icon art that goes way back into the Middle Ages. But they also, from what I understand, is they also have icons. Apparently, this is a continuing tradition. One thing I didn't know is this is a continuing tradition that people are doing icon paintings in that tradition to this day. It'd be, I'd be fascinated to hear about that.
What does the word icon actually mean? Because I think of icons, I think of like Cher. I don't know why. Or
Yes.
Bette Midler or Barbara Streisand. These are cultural icons. But what is it?
Well, I think icons, usually refers to religious celebrities. You're thinking of, like movie celebrities and things like that. I think, the idea here is because it's always like they want to show all the different characters from the Bible and, the different religious traditions and all that. And so, and my understanding is that it was just a way of, it wasn't that the icon was worshipped. I mean, some religions, they would worship an object or something like that. And it wasn't that. They would, it was more, they would revere these objects. Many times they were paintings of Christ or Mary or other characters from the Bible. And so it was a way of kind of inspiring contemplation about these figures, which I think it's very interesting, And it's interesting how because these are Russian icons, comes out of the Eastern Orthodox religion, which had its origins in the old Roman Empire, which later became the Byzantine Empire. And so we many times associate this art with Byzantine art, but it kind of developed its own tradition, its own look that's very unique. It's interesting how because at one time, there was no Eastern Orthodox as opposed to the Roman Catholic Church, which was the Western European religious tradition. And icons were actually produced before the two split. But it seems like the icon tradition of art that we associate, like the Byzantine art we associate with icons today, continued in the Eastern European, the Eastern Roman church tradition, and didn't in the Western tradition. Even though if you look at a lot of Western Roman Catholic art in the Middle Ages, it looks very similar in many ways.
Yeah.
But it changed. I think the difference is it changed for two reasons in the Western part of Europe. The advent of the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, because Western artists started rediscovering the Greek and Roman art of the past, so they started going that direction and started, developing new themes that weren't always religious, and so that influenced religious art as well. Whereas the Byzantine tradition didn't pick up on that Renaissance tradition. So I think that's one factor, and I think a second factor is in the 16th century, 1517 is the actual date when Luther broke away from the Catholic Church and started the Protestant Reformation. I think that also changed religious art in the West in a way that didn't happen in the East.
Maybe I'm naive, but I don't see a lot of, quote, religious art today being produced in galleries and things. I mean, when you see it, it's what they call tchotchkes, kind of thing. But the art of icons isn't part of our culture now.
Right. Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing that there would be a museum like this in Clinton, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Worcester. It's kind of one of the unique museums that we have. Like, I learned the other day that there's a clock museum in Waterbury.
Yes.
There's a radio museum in Windsor Locks.
Yes. Yes.
And some of these small museums in and around New England that feature one small element of the world of art.
Yeah, I think it's very, very interesting that you do see these very specialized museums coming into existence. And it's an interesting phenomenon. Usually, and I think the Russian Icon Museum, the reason it's in Clinton, Mass, is because a collector became very interested in that, became passionate about that subject, and started collecting art. And then pretty soon he had amassed this great collection and decided to establish a museum. And you see this a lot. You see collectors now who put together these collections, they want to form their own museums. And this tradition has been along for quite a while. In this area, the George Walter Vincent Smith Art Museum in Springfield is an example of that. George Walter Vincent Smith was a wealthy, he started in New York City as a businessman making wagons and carriages and things like that. Made a fortune, did really, really well. Decided to retire at the age of 35. I'm a little envious of that. And he immediately did what a lot of wealthy Americans did in the 19th century. Because we didn't have the cultural institutions that we have today in the United States. If you wanted to learn about culture, art, and this sort of thing, you had to go to Europe. And so wealthy Americans traveled over in large numbers in the late 19th century, especially after the Civil War, 1870s, 1880s, that time period, and spent a lot of times on what they call the Grand Tour. And they would spend extensive, now we buzz over there for 2 weeks and come back, right? But George Walter Vincent Smith, after he decided to retire from business, he wanted to pursue art. So he went to Europe. He spent 18 months in Europe in the late 1860s, the years right after the Civil War. He came back to the United States after 18 months over there. He learned all this about art. And he was visiting a friend of his, what had been a business associate here in Springfield. And he met Belle Townsley, the daughter of this business friend, and fell in love with her. They got married. They lived a while in New York, but they came back to Springfield, but he still had this passion for art. And so in the 1880s, after spending about 10 years in Springfield, they went to Europe. They lived in Venice for 6 years, spent 6 years in Venice collecting art. Now here's the strange thing about this. He was very interested in Asian art. That was something a lot of Europeans were becoming interested in the late 19th century, and so he started collecting Asian art. Here was somebody who never went to Asia. He collected all this art in Venice, Italy, because all this art was coming from Asia into Europe. But he brought that collection back, and then decided, when he came back to Springfield in the 1890s, he decided to establish a museum. And today we have the George Walter Vincent Smith Art.
Did he actually live here when he came back, or did he just give the art to Springfield?
Yes, in fact, he lived on Chestnut Street, right where the Museum of Fine Arts is today. If you go to the Quadrangle in Springfield, on one side of the Quadrangle, you have the George Walter Vincent Smith Museum. On the other side, you have the Museum of Fine Arts, which is right on Chestnut Street. Well, that's where his house was. He would walk out of the back door of his house, walk across the Quadrangle, and walk into his museum, the Smith Museum that we know today, that he built in the 1890s.
Wow.
Isn't that something? And he would give you a tour. He would walk in. If you walked in the door of his museum, he many times would greet you and show you around his collection in his museum.
I just wonder if there are people living in the valley today, in Pioneer Valley, that have amassed art collections, either antique art collections or contemporary.
Yes.
That at some point could start their own museum.
My guess is I think there probably are. There's a lot of collectors out there that are amassing collections today, and many times they give them to established museums. New York has got several important collections that were donated to the Metropolitan or the Museum of Modern Art. But you do see large collections, and sometimes these collectors do establish museums. And many times they're similar. And what usually happens is, like in the case with the George Walter Vincent Smith Museum in Springfield, later on it was kind of taken over by what became the Springfield Library and Museums Association. After he died, Belle Townsley, his wife, who had helped him collect this, she was very instrumental in running the museum for a while. They added a wing on in the 1920s. But here we have this museum today that's basically his collection that's been preserved for over 100 years there, and it's an incredible museum. And so you see this. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston is another example of this. Her own collection.
It's funny because that museum is more known for the art heist that took place in the art collection,
which is tragic story. And they've left the blank places on the wall where those paintings were. I mean, really important works.
Well, we had one of the associate directors of the Netflix series about that on Arts Baby. He's the son of Eric Hill and Kate McGuire from Berkshire Theater Group. And they did a documentary about the art heist at the Isabella Stewart Gardner. What a fascinating story.
But still to this day, I mean, that's a museum that's evolved too, from this, basically the museum still occupies her house, the kind of the mansion that she built for herself in the late 19th century. But since then, as the museum has evolved past the time of the collector, they built now a nice new wing off the back of that, and it's a beautiful museum. So it's interesting how sometimes collectors can contribute wonderful museums that become
How do you
art.
know, for example, if you're contributing art to a museum, that it's going to stay in the museum? There was a controversy a couple of years ago when the Berkshire Museum in Pittsfield decided to sell off a bunch of its paintings to either build its endowment or build new exhibitions, and they sold off an Alexander Calder and two Norman Rockwell, or they planned to. And the public went into an outrage, and along with the family of the Rockwell descendants, it said, no, this was given to you to exhibit in perpetuity, and you're selling it off. What happens if I don't know, it just occurred to me, if I gave you the Mona Lisa, okay, it was in my personal collection for the Athenaeum, aren't you obligated, and you accepted it, aren't you obligated to keep it, or can you turn around and sell it?
Yes, this is something that a lot of people don't realize, and that collectors have to be very careful with when they're giving art to a museum. Most museums today will not take what's called a restricted gift. A restricted gift is where the collector says, I'm giving you this painting, but these are the requirements. You can't sell it, or you must exhibit it at all times, or something like that, right? One thing that people need to know is almost every museum out there only show about between 5 and 10% of their collections. So most museums, if a collector walks in and says, I'd like to give you this piece, but you must exhibit it at all times, most museums today say, no, we will not take it into those conditions. So most people give their art to a museum with the understanding that the museum is going to use it in the future as they see fit. They may show it, they may not. And, of course, there are changing trends, styles change, interests change. And so many times art that was exhibited at one time is no longer exhibited in museums, or it's rotated off and on, it's not on exhibit. But also museums sometimes decide to sell works of art. And usually the reason for that is that they've decided that it doesn't really fit with their current collecting mission. Times have changed, or conditions have changed in this. The problem at Berkshire was they weren't following procedures established by the American Museums Association, which kind of establishes ethical practices in this area. And the rule is that if you decide to sell a painting, the money earned from that must go back into buying other paintings or conservation on your existing collection. And the problem with the Berkshire Athenaeum is they wanted it just for general operating expenses, which is a no-no in the museum world. And so the museum world was very upset about what the Berkshire Athenaeum was doing. If they had followed proper procedures, that would have been a different story. But another problem with it is they were selling works of art that were central to their collections because of their value. And they were arguing, well, we need the money to stay open. Well, that's not going to cut it in the museum world. You have to follow proper procedures.
Yeah. I wonder, the fallout from that has happened. I don't know whether they actually sold the works or whether they changed their mind, but it's certainly damage their reputation as a community organization. I've heard.
Absolutely.
I did not cover that story. For whatever reason, it wasn't on my plate to cover as an arts reporter. But I do recall this last summer being in the Berkshires when you mentioned the Berkshire Museum, which is right on the North or South Street as you're coming into Pittsfield. People in the community speaking of its management with disdain, that it really left a scar on the cultural fabric of the community. I don't know if the people involved are still there or moved on or whatever.
I think many of the board of directors have resigned since then because they did not follow proper ethical museum practices in this case, and I think the executive director left as well. And this sort of thing, and so yes, it's something that it's a very serious concern. I mean, a lot of American museums, because American museums don't get the government support that European museums get. Many museums are struggling, especially through the pandemic era, and that's caused a lot of museums to look for ways of raising money. But you've got to follow proper procedures, and that's a very important process, and they didn't do that. But the problem is, I think collectors who have art that they want to donate to a museum, they need to understand that the museums may make decisions later on that this art isn't appropriate for the collection anymore and this sort of thing, and they need to understand that. And good museums, good museum administrators and curators explain that to a potential donor. If a donor is coming forward with a painting, they explain this is the possibilities that exist there, and I think that's also another thing that's very important is that a collector have a very serious discussion with the museum officials to make sure that they understand what they're doing by donating those works of art there. It's a difficult practice, but museums, because of the fact of what I said earlier, museums can only show 10% at best of their works.
The Athenaeum has an exhibit right now. Last time we were on the air, you showed videos of some of the prime pieces.
Right.
And that's maybe 10% of what you have?
Well, in the case of the Athenaeum, our museum is a little smaller. But yes, even there, we pulled out more than 30 paintings. The exhibit that we have up that people can go see right now at the Athenaeum is a wonderful show of art that's been collected over about a 150-year period at the Athenaeum, art that goes back to the middle of the 19th century by Westfield artists and regional artists. And it's a great collection. But even with that show up right now, and we're not always showing a large selection of our paintings as we are right now. We're showing about a third of our art collection right now. Only about a third.
So where do you keep the rest of them?
We keep them in storage in our archive storage facility.
And I would assume, in storing this art, it's got to be climate controlled, and somebody has to go in there and make sure the dust and the cobwebs aren't getting on the paintings.
Yes. We have an archivist / museum curator on staff whose job is to monitor the collection, make sure the collection is in good shape. You have to store it under certain conditions in certain ways. But and one of the things is right now, if you go into the Great Hall of the Athenaeum, most people who go into the library, there's all these portraits that are up, above the bookshelves there. They're all down right now. None of them are up right now because we had to take them down because a lot of them need conservation work. And so we're in the process of doing conservation work. So there's those kind of problems too. So right now, paintings that were on exhibit for quite a while in the Athenaeum are not up right now because of conservation concerns. And another problem with that is to restore a 19th century painting can cost $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 for one painting.
Do you hire somebody to come in and restore it, or do you sit there and do it?
No. We send paintings like this. We send out. There's a great conservation lab at the Clark Museum up in the Berkshires. The Clark Museum has a great conservation lab. They have a whole team of experts who work on the paintings, restore them. They'll put new backings on. They'll sometimes repair frame damage because sometimes frames, sections chip off. They'll restore that, but we're talking about experts. Of course, it's expensive to do.
How long does a painting in the best of conditions? How long does a painting last? I mean, the Mona Lisa, for example, in the Louvre, that's hundreds of years old.
Yeah, dates back to about 1500. Yeah.
So how do they keep it in shape, or is it faded?
Well, certainly you do see fading. Dust collects on paintings. There was a big controversy a few years back about the restoration of the Sistine ceiling, Michelangelo's great work at the Vatican, because once they restored it, it was so much brighter, and people who were so used to the kind of the dark, brownish look of the paintings that when all of a sudden they saw these bright colors, it was shocking to them, and many people thought, you've gone too far, it's not been restored properly. But that's the way it looked when Michelangelo painted it, when it was new. And so the thing is, paintings can last for hundreds of years, even thousands of years in some cases, but they have to be kept in excellent condition, climate-controlled circumstances. Also, too, many times conservators have to go in and work on them, and restore certain aspects. Just dust and dirt.
So you can't take a spray cleaner and just
swab
them down.
No, I'm sorry. No, that doesn't work that way. No, you have to be very meticulous and careful.
What
and
about
restorers?
Sculpture's the same?
Same thing. There are certain things you do and some things you don't do. You have to be very, very careful with sculptures. Certain kinds of marble or bronze, you can get damage to them. Just recently in Westfield, our outdoor sculptures, the Civil War soldier right on the main green in downtown Westfield was restored, and it now has a completely different color. And some people were going like, it doesn't look right, but that's what you have to do to keep these statues in good condition.
So the outdoor statues really need a lot of work. The indoor ones probably last longer.
Longer, but indoor works that have been kept indoors, you still have the same problems with them. Michelangelo, his David, one of his early sculptures, which is considered one of the great works of Western civilization, was originally outside, and they moved it inside into a building in Florence, and they put a copy on the public square in Florence where it had sat, but the original is now inside because of conservation concerns and this sort of thing. So this is a battle. Art museums around the world are constantly battling conservation problems, and it's so expensive. I mean, that's the problem we're having, is raising the money to conserve these paintings is a major project, really difficult.
We only have a minute or two left here, but there's this immersive Van Gogh exhibit traveling around the country.
Yes.
It's supposed to come to Hartford, but I can't find the dates that it might be coming. It's in Boston. What is it?
Well, that's the kind of thing where one of the things that's happening. We have great audio-visual equipment today. We are taking advantage of that with radio and with television and this sort of thing. And I think people are realizing, museums and other people in the art world are realizing that there's a great opportunity to use the audio-visual world to give a different perspective on art of the past, because you can do all kinds of things. You can show work being conserved, for instance. You can show how it's being done, x-rays of paintings that conservators do, which many times tells you something about how the artist worked. You can show, by having these immersive experiences, you can give a perspective to an artist in the past that you might not get from just looking at the paintings. And so I think what this exhibit is all about is using the audiovisual techniques that we have available now to give people a different perspective on
Maybe when it comes to Hartford, you and I need to have a field trip and go down and check
Absolutely.
it out.
It'll be. I'm looking forward to seeing it because some of these things can be very, very interesting, and how they're doing it. And there's film documentaries coming out on artists today, showing their working methods and showing conservation on paintings, and there's a lot of interest today.
But I don't know if you've seen it on social media, but they're constant stuff on Instagram and Facebook with photographs of coming soon to Hartford. Make your plans now.
Yes.
So it sounds like a circus to me, and kind of like one of those they'd have in the '60s, these psychedelic experiences.
Yes.
Where you have a drink or a toke or something and go see this exhibit.
Well, the way I see this is, yes, you're right. This can be kind of hyped, and it can be kind of a popular culture kind of way of interacting with an artist, But I think the value of these is that many times for people who are trying to learn more about art, develop more of an appreciation of art, it gives them a kind of a window in on the artist. But you're right. It shouldn't be an excuse for not going to see the original paintings, because there's nothing like seeing an original Van Gogh. And there's nothing like seeing an original artist from the Renaissance. It's like that, seeing the actual painting, going on the internet and seeing reproductions on the internet or seeing documentaries. That can be very helpful in learning about the art, but you've got to see the original.
I just have a feeling, sight unseen, that this is the place you're going to go, and you go through a huge gift shop first. So you get the T-shirts and the glasses and and all of that kind of stuff, and then you go and it's a sound and light show, and then you go out and you're hungry and you go to the Van Gogh Cafe or something like that.
Right. Yes. Yeah, we love to do. We are influenced by the Disney World. The Disneyland experience. You go to Epcot, and they do things at Epcot that are, about art and culture and, recreating historic villages and things like that. And my feeling is you have to realize what you're getting. You're getting something that can be educational and can be, good for children as a way to introduce children to art. But yeah, I think, ultimately, people have to do the hard thing, which means go to the museums, like the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, or like the Clark Art Museum in the Berkshires, and other museums like that, and look at the art. And I say, art is like anything else. You've got to study it to really understand and appreciate it. And but one aspect that's very important is really spending time looking at a painting. And another thing I'll say about this is, I'll talk about an exhibit at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It was an exhibit of the painter Mark Rothko, a very important artist in the 1950s in America, and they were saying, we've done studies of this. Most people spend less than 10 seconds in front of a painting. When they're going to a museum, 10 seconds, less than 10 seconds in front of the museum. And so this exhibit, the curators and the exhibit labels were saying, you need to spend at least 1 minute in front of this painting to get to understand the painting. They were recommending that with each painting, you spend at least 1 minute in front of it. And so I thought this was very interesting. So I sat there on one of the benches in this exhibit and watched people go through and timed them. Just did this as a little study because of the fact I'm doing exhibits all the time, curating exhibits, and so I thought this is an interesting study. Right here at the beginning of the exhibit, they were recommending 1 minute in front of the painting. Almost none of the people going through the exhibit were spending 1 minute in front of each painting.
Well, we're out of time here, speaking of minutes. And in the meantime, I think people should go down to the Athenaeum and spend at least 1 minute in front of each painting.
Absolutely.
After they buy their tickets for the chamber music concerts that are coming up.
True.
Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great plan.
Yeah.
Come and see the exhibit. And then buy your
Spend
tickets.
At least a minute in front of each painting.
Yes.
Buy your tickets.
There's only about 30 paintings, so that's only 30 minutes.
30 minutes of your time. Then you get a pre-concert talk. Then an hour, 60 minutes of music. It all just like that.
It all works. It all fits together.
You've been listening to or watching Athenaeum Spotlight with Guy McClain today. Peter Coles has been our chief engineer, and that wraps up today's program. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach. If you missed a part of today's program, want to catch it again or share it with friends, it's archived on YouTube and WSKB Community Radio's YouTube page. We'll see you next week.